Rockets fans, welcome to the Rockets Launch Pod, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets, Sports Talk 790. Rockets, ready to go! Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Rockets Launch Pod starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Ben DuBose here, Paulo Alves there. Welcome in to another fresh episode of the Rockets Launch Pod presented by Clutch Fans. As always, we're your host. It's Wednesday, the 8th of July, and there's a lot going on with the Rockets right now. Summer League play will start on Friday afternoon in Las Vegas. Rockets have a fairly exciting squad headlined by Bruce Thornton, Isaiah Crawford, other interesting names, but we'll save discussion of the Summer League guys for a few days from now when we've actually seen them on the court. Today, we're going to be talking about what's happened over the past week because
I'm just going to stop you and say that I think it's really disrespectful that he did not mention lottery talent Dacian Nix or Vipers legend Michael Foster. Just going to throw it out there.
How many consecutive years is this for Michael Foster on the Summer League team?
I don't know how he's still eligible. It shows up Michael Foster Jr., which makes me think this might be the son of the guy that played for the Rockets 4 years ago.
What's funny, I saw someone saying that the Rockets don't have enough bulk on their Summer League roster, pointing to, there's a lot of perimeter players. Hey, Dacian Nix is listed at, I believe, 239 pounds. So he's a pretty thick guy, and I think he's 6'5" as well. So technically, he could be a front court guy. Of course, we know he'll be handling the ball.
That's basically PJ Tucker measurements.
That's true. Although I guess Bruce Thornton should be the primary ball handler. There's a lot of excitement there. And now he's on a really great contract. 4-year Hinkie special starting at the rookie minimum this year. Every future year is non-guaranteed, a team option. So nice job of Rafael Stone negotiating there. That's a trend we'll certainly talk about today. Actually, you know what? That's a perfect transition to topic A, which is the extension for Tari Eason, because there's a lot that's happened over the last week. The Tari extension, which has been hovering over this franchise and Tari specifically for pretty much a year now, and at times it clearly affected his play last season. You also had the departure of Josh Okogie, the salary offloading of Dorian Finney-Smith, the external signings of Marcus Smart and Bogdanovic. We'll talk about all of those today. But let's start with Tari, because I think that's the one with the biggest big picture implications, because he's one of your 5 recent first-round draft picks, 25 years old, and now he's under contract for 5 years, $81 million, just a tick over $16 million in average annual value. And to me, that's really nice work by Rafael Stone, getting a good rotation player and someone that still has upside to perhaps be a little bit more than that at a rate that's roughly equivalent to the non-taxpayer mid-level exception. So, Paulo, let's start there. You've been a Tari fan for a while. What was your reaction when you saw news of this deal and the financial terms getting over the finish line?
Oh, just ecstatic. I think, I know Tari's 25. He's on the other side for prospects. But I do think that he hasn't reached his ceiling yet. He had a better shooting season from 3 last season. Didn't have the best defense. Didn't have the best decision making. It seems like every season he's just excellent at something different. There were the insane offensive rebounding seasons, and he's still good as an offensive rebounder, but it's not quite as impactful as it once was. He had a season where he got a lot better finishing at the rim. I mean, he was better finishing at the rim this season too. Even though the percentages don't show it, it's just he was taking terrible shots. And then, there's obviously the Terror Twins season where defensively he and Emmanuel were just a menace. If you can put all 3 of those seasons together, you're looking at one of the best, if not the best 3-and-D guy in the league. When you talk about purely, defense and shooting, switchable defense and shooting. So, you guys know I've always been a massive Tari Eason guy. You need there's guys that are leaders and that set culture. then there's guys that enforce that culture. And Tari, with his intensity game to game, is someone that helps enforce that culture, and it's something that we've missed from Dylan Brooks, because Dylan Brooks did both, right? He did play with a lot of intensity, but at the same time had the locker room presence. Like Tari is, one of those executors of that culture, and he fits really well with his plus offensive rebounding into the philosophy that the Rockets currently have, which is possession maxing. And I think last season Tari had, love it or hate it, like love him or hate him, a very lackluster season at anything besides 3-point shooting. It felt like he had a chip on his shoulder because he didn't get the extension in the summer. Perhaps he was expecting more, and so he was trying to prove that he could, maybe sell some team on some upside on shot creation. And it just, he wasn't playing smart basketball. And, that showed in his shooting percentages, lows at everything besides 3-point shooting. And when you consider how hot he started, the fact that it ended up at just 36% to end the season at the end of the season isn't great. But I think it was mostly mental. And I think now that his contract is settled down, like he's not going to go anywhere for the next 4 years, no need to worry about it. And when he finally hits free agency, it won't, like, his next payday won't be based on any upside. At that point he'll be 29 years old at the very least. So people won't be paying a premium for upside; they'll be paying a premium for his production as a 3-and-D guy. And so I think he can finally lock in into being the best version of himself that he can be. That the contract is ironed out. I'm really happy to have him be here, and I think from a value perspective, it's just like a masterclass by Rafael Stone. And I know this is not a hot take, and I know everybody gives props to Son for his contract negotiation skills, but I mean, the only thing that you can really put a finger at is the fact that there's a player option, and I typically don't like those because I like predictability, and player options are unpredictable. But that being said, the fact that the player option right is its value, or it is diminished by the fact that this contract is not like Jabari Smith's contract. This contract is actually descending. It is actually ascending, sorry. So it starts really low at like 14 point something million, and it climbs all the way to 20 million, which means that the contract's going to be really cheap for the first 4 years, and the last year is the one that's the most expensive. And that's where, like, if Tari opts out, it's not like he's opting out of a descending deal in which, he's opting out of the 14 million season when the contract started at like 19. No, he's going to opt out of the 19 million season. If he does, maybe he doesn't. And there's also the option of, the opt out and extend, or an extend earlier on during the contract. Those things will come in time. But that's a nice, neat little thing as well. So I think, for a 3-and-D guy, that's really starter caliber for most contending teams. I think Tari would start for most contending teams. I think it's just with these measurables, if the shooting's real, even if it isn't, like, he's never been a really poor shooter. I think it's just a massive win, and it's, going forward, you can really solidify Tari Eason and Jabari Smith Jr. as two guys that you have cost control that are going to fit into any type of team build that you want. Right? So it's really unlikely that those guys will ever be moved, because whatever superstar you get, those guys are going to fit around them. Play up or down a position, but they'll still fit whatever team it is. Guys that defend and shoot threes at a high level will always fit into whatever team contract you want to have. So I think those two guys are really, like, probably going to be franchise, like, icons in the same way that people look at Shane Battier, or that people look at PJ Tucker, those types of guys that, you blink and they've been on the team for like 8 years now, which would be what Tari would be by the end of that deal. And so I just think it's a massive win in terms of value as well. I think 14 million is really low. And I know we'll segue into, and I know we'll talk about this later with the Dorian Finney-Smith deal, but the Tari Eason extension really is what opens up the door for the Rockets to be able to reset the tax repeater clock with the Dorian Finney-Smith deal. Like, the fact that they can start as low as 14 million, which is pretty insane. Like, we were talking about, like, I said last year I would be okay with a 5-year, 100 million extension. That would put Tari Eason at 20 million AAV. He signed for 16 million AAV. And, obviously, since you can, have an ascending backloaded pay structure, that means that the first year can get really cheap. and we'll get into the importance of this later, but for a team that, with a extension, is really likely to be a tax-paying team for a really long time, and that really starts to hurt with repeater tax. It's really important that they manage to do that this season. I think Tari Eason's extension is a really, really big part of it. And besides, I don't even think that was the biggest piece of news of that day. I mean, Tari Eason may have gotten $80 million guaranteed, may or may not be life-changing money, but I did get an invite to a barbecue in Houston. So who's really winning here?
I saw that. Tari's mom has always appreciated you, and it's not easy to get on her good side. So I'm glad that she's presumably a fan of this podcast, although I've never asked her how she feels about me. Look, to close the loop on Tari, there's a good summary. Fred Katz over at The Athletic, one of my favorite national voices covering the league, wrote a story on Tuesday recapping the first week of free agency and the best value contracts in the league. And the first name he listed was Tari Eason. And I'm not going to read everything that he wrote, but the final paragraph. Eason has an injury history and an errant jump shot, but he's also a fast break extraordinaire and a defensive dynamo on the perimeter. His 26 to 27 salary projects to be a hair over $14 million, exactly what you just laid out, Paulo. And for reference, that's been the going rate for quality backup big men such as Jock Landale and Robert Williams III, not 25 minutes per game wings capable of closing games. So from a value perspective, it's hard to argue with what the Rockets did. And the injury history, for all the struggles that Tari had, especially in the second half of last season with his jump shot, perhaps focusing on the wrong things because of the contract uncertainty, as you laid out. One thing that shouldn't go unnoticed is that he did seem to put the issues with his leg behind him. That cost him a lot of time in years 2 and 3. This past season, he played 60 regular season games. He played all 6 in the playoffs, and he could have played about 75 if not for that fluky oblique injury the first month of the year that could have happened to anybody. From the point he returned from the oblique, he was very available, very reliable, at least in terms of availability. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. There are chronic injuries. With rare exceptions, there aren't chronically injury-prone people. And so with Tari, you don't necessarily have to worry about, him being prone to nicks and bumps. No, what you worry about is if he's having a consistent issue with the same body part. That's what I think gave the Rockets so much trepidation last offseason when apparently they were not as willing to give $80 million in guaranteed money. This deal is fully guaranteed, albeit at a lower AAV. With all the issues he had last season, one positive that shouldn't be overlooked is that he did put the issues with his leg behind him, and I think that's something that gave the Rockets a little more confidence, at least medically, in what they can expect from him moving forward. Obviously, there's things he needs to iron out from a basketball perspective, and, what we saw last season and how tilted the restricted free agency market is in favor of teams likely drove down that AAV and his market around the league. But there was one positive. You have to squint a little bit, but I do think that injury risk goes down a little bit relative to this time a year ago, and that's something that should have you feeling a bit better about this deal. Now, as far as why the Rockets couldn't do any better than this, and it's probably silly to ask that question, but I did see it on my social media feeds. Oh, why didn't the Rockets go out and push that deal down even more? Dare him to come back with an offer from another team, since as a restricted free agent, the Rockets can match. So why did the Rockets bid against themselves? Why not, see if you can get him any cheaper than this? I mean, as you laid out, the context is pretty clear. This is a great deal for someone of Tari's stature in the league, and there's a reason why writers around the league are praising it as one of the best value signings in free agency. But even though there wasn't really cap space for Tari, what few teams had space, like the Nets and the Lakers, pretty clearly they pivoted to other options because they didn't think that Tari was really going to be available, especially with the Rockets having the ability to match. There were and are a number of non-taxpayer mid-level exceptions. So even if teams around the league didn't have cap space, they could have come very close to that $16 million in average annual value figure, at least $14-15 million, but you wouldn't have been able to get the 5th year, and you also wouldn't have been able to structure the contract as you wanted. You would have been subject to the other team structuring it exactly as they want. So I think the non-taxpayer was clearly Tari's floor. There was no way that he was going to fall below that when you consider what he's shown you through 4 NBA seasons and the upside when he's right. He was always going to get, at a bare minimum, $14-15 million, and he probably deserves more than that, but restricted really drove it down. So the Rockets paid a very slight premium, a little bit above the mid-level for the sake of being able to structure it themselves. And then that's probably not even the biggest risk. The biggest risk wouldn't so much be him signing for the non-taxpayer. It would be him signing for the qualifying offer, which there was some fear inside the building over the past month that might happen. And if he was to sign the qualifying offer, i.e. he was so discontent with what the Rockets were offering, but wasn't getting what he thinks he deserves elsewhere, maybe restricted free agency is artificially driving down his market relative to what he deserves. I mean, the NBA and the players union, I should say, has negotiated an alternative, and that's to basically bet on himself, exactly what he did this past year, do it again, take the $8 million qualifying offer, which includes a no trade clause for this coming season, and allows him to become an unrestricted free agent a year from now. So you would have been staring down the barrel of losing him for no compensation if you had tried to drive down to non-taxpayer or lower. He easily could have taken the qualifying offer. It's not a foreign concept to him, betting on himself. He just did it this past year, and it may have negatively impacted his play this coming season, just as we wondered about in the season that just concluded. And I just feel like cooler heads prevail. The Rockets got a deal that works for them. I think for Tari, he's going to play better, not having this cloud hanging over him. And so I give both sides credit for, even if it wasn't perfect, especially in Tari's case, for what they wanted, at the end of the day, cooler heads prevail, and they hammered out a deal that works for both sides. And it's important to negotiate in good faith. We talked about Rafael being good at contracts. That's not just what happens in a few days each June and July. It's constantly managing relationships so that players and their agency representation believe that you're negotiating in good faith. Because if they think you're not negotiating in good faith, that's when tools like the qualifying offer come into play. If the Rockets had been such extreme hardliners to say, well, we'll just wait for you to set your market, and if you can't find anything better than the non-taxpayer, even though your play warrants more than that, well, tough, deal with it. That's where you sort of poison the relationship. And we've seen Rafael Stone do a good job of getting favorable terms, especially with the Rockets' younger players. And I think it's in part because these relationships are nurtured and developed carefully over a period of years. And that matters. Like, that's not to say that Rafael Stone is a perfect GM. He's absolutely not. We'll talk about the Dorian Finney-Smith contract momentarily and the mistake that was and having to offload it with 3 second-round picks. Rafael is far from perfect, but I don't like the way a lot of people portray his excellence with contracts as a footnote, as if it's like 10 to 20% of the job. No, contracts in the NBA, they are a big deal. It's maybe the most important thing that he does, especially in this NBA where, we'll talk about it more momentarily, but the salary cap is not rising as quickly as expected. So value deals are becoming all the more important. We just saw the Boston Celtics offload Jaylen Brown for what it amounts to, I feel like, neutral value, maybe even slightly negative when you consider the Paul George contract. And that's not any disrespect to JB as a player. He won a championship and was NBA Finals MVP just 2 years ago. But even someone that's accomplished that much, if he's not viewed as a value guy for the contract, in his case, over $60 million in average annual value, that's why I've reported in the past that the Rockets weren't interested. then that negatively impacts, how he fits into your team's puzzle and the value he has around the league. So contracts matter. It's a huge part of a GM's job, especially in the modern NBA with this CBA. It's not a footnote, and it's also not something that happens just over a few days each June and July during the draft and free agency period. It's a constant nurturing of relationships that eventually yields positive results. Maybe not every time, but a lot the last few years with Rafael Stone. So, Paulo, I'm curious your perspective on that. We don't need to litigate Rafael's entire GM tenure here. Certainly there's some hits and misses, as with any GM, but I do feel like his strengths with contracts, they shouldn't be portrayed as a footnote the way it feels like a lot of fans are doing at the moment because they're frustrated with some of the other things. Like, this is a really important skill, right?
Yeah, 100%. Like, the way it's going, like, you're seeing, well, the cap's not rising as much as people expected, right? It usually rises 10%. It's rising like 6. And projections show it's slowing down, not picking back up, which means that all of these max deals that are, people usually say they're tied to a percentage of the cap. They're only tied to a percentage of the cap the moment they are signed. After that, after the first year of the contract starts, the money is set in stone. It's whatever percent it was in year 1, and then it's 8% raises if it's a bird rights contract, right? So because of that, having under max deals is really important. And people often talk about how the Rockets don't have the 1A guy. Well, yes, the Rockets may not have the number 1A guy, but they've also missed or managed to avoid the biggest downfall of teams that don't have a clear number 1A top 10 player in the league type, which is something like what the Magic have done with both of their guys. Like, none of those two guys currently looks like they're going to end up being a number 1A guy, but they're both getting paid max contracts because the Magic just did what a lot of teams do, and they gave them a max contract because they look like they could be max players in the future. They were close enough. And so they got those contracts, and now the Magic are very, the Wendell Carter Jr. contract's really good. The Bane one's okay, but they're really tied, like they have their hands tied behind their back on what they can do. And that's really common. And then another test of this will be, how does the Amen Thompson contract extension pan out? Because he is the one guy on this team that has the potential to be a number 1A guy, but he's not quite there. And I think there's some more than he needs to show. Will he get a max? Like, the Rockets at this moment seem like if he were to get a max contract offer, he would have gotten it already. Which means that the Rockets are not just going to give it to him the same way Magic gave it to Franz Wagner and Paulo Banchero. And so that's definitely a skill, and that's definitely a skill that...
And to manage the relationship all while doing that.
Yeah, and then there's a once
and
you
making
do
sure
it with,
the player is on board.
Yeah, no, once you do it with the first guy and the second guy, guys no longer can feel disrespected by it because you're doing it with everybody else. Like, everybody, like, Rafael Stone's not going to hand a max contract extension to, or he hasn't, to any of the players before the guys that we have now. And so he establishes the precedent that, there's no guy he won't negotiate with. And so the fear of guys feeling insulted by not getting outright max contracts is a bit diminished because, that's just not the way the front office operates. The same way the Pacers, for example, have or had over the past decade a reputation for having really good value deals. And when they came to reach extensions with their players, sometimes young players that had, that reputation, they ended up getting really good value deals. And throughout the last 10 years, up until the Haliburton max contract, you often looked at the Pacers as the team with the best value contracts in the league. That was a good team, not a great team, but had, always really good contracts, and they were always a superstar away from having a really good surrounding cast and a really good cap sheet around them. Like, they had Victor Oladipo on his all-star form before he fell off on, I think, $20 million a year, something close to it. The first contract the Domantas Sabonis signed was like $14, $15, $16, $17, $19 million a year for 5 years. which is you may not like Sabonis, but that's an awesome deal for a young Sabonis. And so the Rockets follow a lot of the same path, and they have that reputation, which means that there's no that whole side of players being insulted for not just getting given what they want. Just doesn't work because that's not how the Rockets operate, and it's not this personal disrespect to anybody. It's just how the team operates. Now, I do want to touch on something that I think, Tari obviously had the I guess bruh tweet before the extension, and I think it like half an hour before the extension gets leaked, and I do think that it's 100% to do with the extension. Some people have said that maybe he's mad with the Rockets for not having gotten what he wanted, and I'm sure there's some level of that going on. But I think above all, I think he's probably mad at his agent because his agent played this as poorly as he could possibly play it. Like Tari Eason's agent, for reference, is the same agent of Jalen Duren, who had a breakout season and still doesn't have a contract signed. And cap space is drying up around the league, and it's looking like he's gonna have to settle for whatever the Pistons offer him. That or a qualifying offer, which is especially scary for him because he had one really good season. If he takes a qualifying offer and doesn't perform to the same level, it's going to be looked at as a fluke, and he's losing millions of dollars. And what happened was, Duran, in Duran's case, he's very clearly overplaying his end. And so and people say free agency is boring nowadays. And why is that? Because nobody has cap space anymore. Well, that's especially true when you go days and days deeper into free agency, because the teams that have cap space have either taken salary dumps to get assets out of that cap space, have gone after better players perhaps or better fits, and cap space dries up very quickly, and all of a sudden there's no cap space for you anymore, and the best you can get is the non-tax mid-level, which is I think what happened with Tari. Like, I genuinely believe that Tari had a better contract on the table. Like, this is not informed. This is my speculation. That Tari had a better contract on the table at the end of last season than he did this season. It might have been the same guaranteed money.
I think it was less guaranteed, but the average annual value, there was more upside after last season.
Exactly.
Let's put it that way.
That's sort of like non-guaranteed money might look like it sucks for a normal, maybe an NFL fan. For the NBA, it's not really like that, because more often than not, guys with partial guarantees get the rest of that year's salary guaranteed anyway, because the other option is for the team to have that money in their books and not have a player for it. For example, Duncan Robinson, I believe, had $8 million guaranteed on his deal. That's $16 million. The Pistons are more than likely going to guarantee the rest of this deal, regardless of what his play looked like, because it's better than having a $8 million hole in a roster when you're trying to contend. And so that's very like a $100 million contract with $80 million guaranteed is a lot better than a $80 million contract fully guaranteed, because more often than not, that's what ends up happening. And so I think Tari probably wasn't happy at the way the negotiations went, and was, in my opinion, probably misguided by his agent, who just managed the situation like really poorly for Tari, because not only, like, even if he were to get non-tax mid-level offers, the teams offering that still had to have that cap space locked up for I think it's 72 hours, which means that's even like it hadn't happened up until the extension. So it would be at the very least until early this week where that team, if the Rockets had matched, would be able to offer that to another player. And it's not like, you could argue, oh, maybe they make that offer's public, but they're negotiating with someone else behind the scenes. Not really like that, because whoever they're negotiating with behind the scenes, that player knows that the offer that they have from that team is not guaranteed, because if the Rockets don't match, that player's left holding the bag, right? So that player, if he gets a competitive offer from somewhere else, then they're probably going to take it. So you truly have your hands tied when you make an offer for a restricted free agent, and you really have to have like no comparable plan B in terms of value for you to do that. So restricted free agency, intentionally so, is really hard on the player's negotiating position for obvious reasons, right? So yeah, I just think Tari, like, especially considering that Tari did want to stay in Houston and he made that clear, at various points last season and, at the end of the season. It was just terribly played. And then every day that went by, Tari had less and less leverage up until the point in which the deal that he got is basically the MLE with an extra year that's a player option. So barely a step up from an MLE offer. Like that's the Rockets. All the Rockets had to do was beat a straight up MLE offer.
Yep.
And in exchange, and what they did to beat it, it was literally, hey, you can have a fifth year that's a player option because we know at this valuation in 5 years, like in 5 years, 19 million will be well below the MLE, even with the local cap projection numbers. So you like this deal, but like this player option is has basically no, well, knock on wood, but unless a catastrophic injury happens, basically zero downside for the Rockets. Like if he doesn't, like the expectation is that he's not going to pick it up because it's just too low by then. So all the Rockets had to do was give that extra little bit of guaranteed money in case something terrible happened to beat out an MLE offer. Like that's how poorly Tari Eason's agent played it. He played it so poorly that he literally got the bare minimum above what every other team that's not paying tax could offer. That's just terrible, terrible, terrible negotiating on their part. And props to the Rockets for holding on to their cards and playing it until the end, knowing that when push came to shove, they just called Tari Eason's agent's bluff and got a massive, really good value deal out of it.
Yeah, they absolutely did. And I agree with you. I think people are reading a little too much into that "I guess" tweet. There's a number of things that could have been directed at. I mean, certainly the contract, but there's several angles within it. It could also be the concept of restricted free agency, which is tilted so in favor of teams. And of course, that should be his agent's responsibility to, make him aware of and thus take into account when negotiating that if it gets to this point, that it's likely not going to end well for the player. But I do give Tari a lot of credit. I mentioned cooler heads prevailing, that he didn't let this drag out all of the offseason the way a lot of restricted free agency situations tend to do when there's this discomfort with the team offering, something that's in line with the market and the player being upset because they're sort of artificially held down by the concept of a restricted market. And so it drags on for 2-3 months, sometimes up until training camp. Tari got this done within the first 24 hours or 48 at the most, I can't remember, of the free agency window. So I do give him a lot of credit for knowing when to say when and saying, look, this has drug on long enough. I just want to concentrate on basketball. I want to be here. This is reasonable compensation. Maybe it's not everything that I had hoped and dreamed, but regardless, let's get this deal done. And so it's not hanging over him as a cloud the way it was for all of last offseason and pretty clearly into the season as well. Now, let's transition into a topic that's less friendly to Rafael Stone, which is the Dorian Finney-Smith salary offloading to Charlotte. And there's both the micro of how the deal came to be, why it required 3 second-round picks. There's the macro of what it says about the team's luxury tax strategy this season. We'll get into both. But I want to start by acknowledging the obvious. This was a disastrous signing for the Rockets, and it is a negative on the resume of Rafael Stone. Now, in terms of how it happened, look, he was coming off a very good year with the LA Lakers, and I believe the Brooklyn Nets before that, traded at midseason. He had ankle surgery in June of 25, a few weeks before he signed with the Rockets. They did have access to his medicals. They were not involved when he actually had the surgery, so I'm not sure exactly what they knew and didn't know. But the way it's been sort of explained to me is that there were no concerns at the time of the signing other than just, generally checking the surgery records and whatnot. It wasn't until the weeks and months ahead when there are these checkpoints in the rehab process that he just was not close to clearing. And that was the point in which they realized that this was not healing as intended. And so that's not meant to give them a pass. I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to speculate on what could or couldn't have been seen on their review of the surgery records when they agreed to that deal at the end of June last year. But the bottom line is that as the weeks and months progressed, as we got closer to training camp and the regular season, the Rockets and Dorian both realized that something wasn't right here. And by the end of the year, it was pretty clear that the surgery had actually made it worse. He had been playing through nagging ankle pain the last couple of years and still playing well. Unfortunately, the surgery not only did it not correct the issue, it seemingly made it a little bit worse with regards to his mobility. And I think it's pretty clear now that his days as an NBA player might be done. Maybe he gets one or two more looks at the minimum, but it's already been reported. The Hornets have no plans to keep him. He was simply taken on with their non-taxpayer mid-level exception to buy 3 second-round picks from the Rockets. So that's sort of how this came to be. I was told the Rockets didn't have much hope of DFS bouncing back next season, which is another factor in why they did the deal now. Part of the incentive to wait until midway through the coming season would be if you had hopes of maybe him providing some value on the court or rehabilitating his value as an asset by playing well. Pretty clearly, the Rockets doctors were not expecting that and did not expect that as a likely scenario. So that's how we got here. But regardless, the facts are this was someone they signed at the non-taxpayer a year ago, basically a 2-year, $27 million deal. It was reported as 4 for 53, but the last 2 seasons were non-guaranteed. So basically 2 for 26. And look, it's not just that. It's the fact that signing him to the non-taxpayer hard capped them at the first apron, and then combine that with the 1+1 structure of the Fred VanVleet extension at the time, and the Rockets weren't able to trade him because of the implied no trade clause, and so they were hard capped at the first apron. Fred was literally untradeable without his consent. DFS was pretty much untradeable because of the contract. If it required 3 second-round picks to move him as an expiring, just imagine what it would have taken to use him as salary matching filler with multiple years left on the deal. So the bottom line, last year's team was stuck. And for Rafael Stone, I'm explaining how this came to be, just, as a little bit of a peel back the curtain so that fans understand, what happened leading up to and following the signing. But regardless, GMs, coaches, you're judged by results. So even if it's understandable, even if, nothing sinister happened in regards to, like medical malpractice or anything crazy like that, look, at the end of the day, it was a failed signing using certainly not max salary resources, but something of significance. It also hard capped you at the first apron, and it came immediately after another deal, the Fred extension that gave him an implied no trade clause. And yeah, it was bad luck when Fred then tore his ACL and was unavailable as a player and also unmovable on the trade market. But regardless, the end result was that the Rockets were very boxed in with last season's team, and with the first apron hard cap and the salaries that were basically unmovable, there just wasn't a whole lot they could do to upgrade those clear holes. And yeah, that's a black mark for Rafael Stone. I just think that when you consider the context and you look at all the other success stories that he's had throughout the 5 or 6 years that he's been on the job now, I think clearly the good outweighs the bad. And so you just have to, keep context in mind. But I say that off the top to acknowledge for those fans that are angry, yeah, you have a right to be angry. These were, in hindsight, poor decisions that limited what the Rockets could do last season. Now, in terms of how the Rockets dealt with the problem, which was basically coming to grips with the reality that DFS was unlikely to bounce back as a player. So what do we do with this contract? I think what happened was tied, and you hinted at this earlier, Paulo, with the Tari extension. Because when Tari's deal came in at $16 million in average annual value and at barely over 14 this year, that's significantly less than what we were expecting even a month ago. It was reported in May by the Houston Chronicle that the Rockets and Tari were likely to come to an agreement, but the figure that was thrown out in the Chronicle was $22 million in average annual value. Instead, it comes in closer to 15. Well, that $7 million figure is basically Clint Capella's contract. And so where I think this tied in with the Rockets' macro strategy, let's start there, and then we'll get into the value of the deal. by Tari's deal being as cheap as it was, there was a path to where the Rockets could trade Dorian Finney-Smith and DFS alone from the roster as it was, and that be enough to be under the luxury tax line. And as you mentioned earlier, push back the clock on the repeater tax, which has so many punitive penalties. And this team is going to be increasingly expensive as Amen gets his next deal. And Reed, a year from now, hopefully earns a big deal himself. And we'll see if Kevin Durant sticks around. If not, I suspect his contract turns into something else. Like, this team is going to be in tax territory for a while. This is the last year that they're sort of artificially cheap. Tari coming in cheaper than expected, and Amen and Reed both still on their first contracts. So when it became possible to dip beneath the tax line by trading only DFS, I think that's when it got more tempting. If you would have had to trade DFS and Clint Capella, I don't think they would have done it, because I think Clint Capella is really important insurance for Steven Adams at his age, coming off of ankle surgery. Clint Capella is still a solid backup big in the NBA, and he's also salary filler. You know, we've talked in the past about using DFS if he's on the books as salary filler midseason. Well, you still have Clint Capella at over $7 million for that purpose. It's not quite the same, but it's also not nothing. It's also not a minimum deal. So to bring it full circle, if you had had to offload both DFS and Clint, and what that means for both your roster next season and trade possibilities, I think that would have been too much. And I think for all of us, that was our expectation with what had previously been reported about Tari's terms. When Tari's deal came in this cheap, and it made it to where you could dip below the tax by just shedding DFS, keeping Clint, yeah, you have to pay a premium to offload the DFS deal of 3 second-round picks, but, you know, that's nothing huge in the grand scheme. At that point, I think it made a lot more sense to the Rockets. And they can still fill out the roster. To be clear, they've got 3 spots. One of them was actually filled Tuesday when they signed Bruce Thornton, but they've still got 2 more minimums. So you can fill out your roster with minimum guys, keep Clint Capella, and still stay under the tax. I've had that confirmed. So with that in mind, I think it's clear that plan A is to avoid the tax this season. However, in direct contrast to what happened a year ago, the scenario I just laid out, the Rockets do want to make sure that this season there is a plan B. They have learned from the ways they tied their hands a year ago. And so by offloading DFS for basically nothing, they do get a trade exception worth over $13 million, which can be used to take in salary from other teams. And so if things aren't going well, if something happens, you know, there's an injury this year, similar to Fred or Steven from a year ago, you can use that TPE and go even above the first apron. Keep in mind the Marcus Smart deal, we talked about this last week. They didn't give the third year, which would have required the non-tax pyramid level, for this reason. The third year would hard cap you at the first apron the way they were a year ago. They didn't do that this year. They're hard capped at the second apron, which is significantly higher. So they can use the traded player exception that they get for Dorian Finney-Smith. They can't aggregate it with other salaries, but you can use it. It's big enough to take in a significant player, and it can give tax relief to another team. You can make a trade combining salaries, including the aforementioned Clint Capella by midseason. Maybe by that point, there's another young big that you feel more confident in their development, or maybe, you know, Steven's all the way back and you're close enough to the playoffs. Maybe a Clint trade is more palatable by midseason. The point is that plan A, I think they like the team they have now. They have a 52-30 team, and they're adding, you know, Fred and Steven back. They expect them to be fully ready to go by camp. You added Marcus Smart. We'll see what they get from Bogdanovic. Bruce Thornton, maybe he surprises as a 4-year college player. They like this team, but they also want a plan B. And so in a perfect world, yeah, plan A, stay beneath the tax, roll with what you've got. But they also want the ability and have the ability to use the TPE or to combine salaries later on if the right deal presents itself, if you need a rotation upgrade, if a star that's in alignment both in the short term and long term comes available on the market that isn't there right now. the Rockets wanted to make sure they have the flexibility to pivot, be it later in the offseason or more likely during the season. So I think that's where we're at from like a macro team building strategy. The way they looked at this roster, if the only thing standing between them and the luxury tax and by extension delaying the repeater tax was Dorian Finney-Smith, who they didn't expect anything from as a player, or the second round picks it would take to offload, to them, that was an acceptable loss. If they also had the ability to pivot to a different strategy later on if circumstances warrant, and I'm told there was no edict from Tillman Fertitta that they must be below the tax. No, this is just strategic. This is saying, hey, the way we are right now, we didn't need DFS. The cost to offload him, not great, but it wasn't anything huge. And so if we can delay the repeater tax and not have to worry about hard decisions down the road, great. But then if we do need to do something bigger, we leave ourselves a path to do that as well. So, Paulo, I'm just curious. We'll get into the micro in a few minutes, but let's start with the macro and what it says about the whole like team building strategy. Are you on board with, let's call it the flex approach of plan A being ducking the tax, but also leaving yourself a path to go back over it if circumstances warrant?
Yeah, if you remember correctly, before like anybody had even considered it, I DM'd just saying, wait, what if they duck the tax instead? Do you remember that?
Yes.
Because truth is, like, here's how the repeater tax works, right? You pay normal tax, which is, it escalates every 5 million you're over. But it goes from 100, like you pay $1.50 per dollar you're over the tax. So if you're 5 million over the tax line, you're gonna pay those 5 million, which is the norm, like for the player, you're gonna pay that 5 million to the player, plus you're gonna pay 7.5 million of tax to the league. And as you go, if you're past 5 million, over 5 million, that's 175 per dollar. Then it goes up to 250 per dollar if you're 10 or to 15 million over, then it goes to 325 per dollar. And so if you are 15 million over the tax, you're going to pay over 45 million of tax beyond what you already pay payroll to your players, right? So this is normal standard tax rate, right? Once you get into repeater tax, which is the scary part, I think Tillman would pay standard tax up to these amounts. Now, once you talk about repeater tax, that's when it gets really scary, and that's when you get the types of situations like the super team Golden State Warriors that pay like over 2 times their payroll in tax to the league. So basically, they had a payroll which was basically 3 times what everybody else's was. In that situation, once you go into repeater tax, it starts at 3.25 for the first 5 million. So if you're 5 million over the luxury tax, in repeater tax, you're already paying 15 million just for the first. If you are 15 million over the luxury tax line and you're a repeat offender, you're going to pay 5 times that, which is 60, 75. Like you're going to pay $75 million for being just over 15 million over the tax. That's when it's like only the uber rich owners are ever going to pay that in the league. And so it's scary because once teams get into the repeater tax, like it or not, they're going to start dumping valuable players in order to lower that tax bill, because it just doesn't, like, most owners, or like 95% of owners are not going to pay that unless your team's really, really good. Like, you look at the Thunder this season. They dumped Isaiah Joe for nothing, for 2 second-round picks because they had to lower that tax. They dumped Kenrich Williams, which is, they signed them back later, but they had to dump him to lower his contract value because of the luxury tax. So you shouldn't see this as ownership being cheap. You should see this as, if we don't do this now, in 3 to 4 years, we're going to lose an important, probably a starter, because we're going to have to avoid being in repeater tax. How does the repeater tax work beyond just the dollar numbers, right? For you to be a repeat tax offender, you have to be in the tax for 3 of the past 4 years. So once you go into 4 of the last 5, you're going to the repeater tax. The Rockets were in the tax last season. The Rockets, if they were going to be in the tax this season, after next season, they would already be repeat offenders. And so you have, and as you said, the Rockets are basically guaranteed to be in the tax unless they go into a rebuild again in the next few seasons, because you have Tari, you have Jabari under contract. You're still gonna want, like, you still don't have that star. You're gonna have Amen Thompson as well, and so if you want to build a good team, the Rockets are always going to be a luxury tax team once their rookie contracts get paid. And so it just made sense that if you could break up the repeater tax streak this year, it just gives you so much more flexibility in a way that, so this year they don't pay it. Going forward, they can basically pay tax 3 years in a row and have no problem. So just breaking that up is really important as far as team building goes going into the future.
And as far as the value of the deal, this is something that I think has been misunderstood. So one clear takeaway, if you don't like the price of 3 second-round picks, and should be noted, by the way, future second-round pick values in a lot more flux than they used to be. One of the picks is the 27 from Memphis, which before lottery reform, you'd feel confident is high in the second round. Can't really say that anymore. Now the second round is the inverse of the first round. And the other two, 28 and 33 Rockets picks, you hope those are towards the back of the second round because the Rockets look like a playoff team for the foreseeable future, but who knows? Point is, 3 second-round picks, it is a steep price. And so when you lay out the tax concerns, some people will undoubtedly ask, well, why did they start the clock last season and pay the tax on a team that, had as many obvious flaws as that one did? Well, I think one thing that's becoming very clear, it would have cost a major premium to offload Dorian Finney-Smith at last year's trade deadline. If it costs this to get rid of him now, you're looking at least one first-round pick, I think, if you were offloading him in February, and perhaps more than that with multiple seasons left on that deal. And in an environment where more and more teams are close to the tax line. You mentioned earlier the salary cap not rising as quickly as expected. A lot of that has to do with local TV media rights and that bubble collapsing a little bit, and some of the other deals that aren't indexed to a percentage of the cap. Well, what that's led to is more and more teams being close to that tax line. And so offloading a salary for a guy who doesn't really provide any basketball value, it's tough. And so even though in a perfect world you could have avoided the tax last season in a year in which you clearly weren't a legitimate contender, yeah, that would have been ideal. But I think the value of this deal shows you that just wasn't realistic. And then as far as this year, I think there's a little bit of a misnomer. I've seen the notion around that Rafael Stone undervalues second round draft picks. And my response to that is, undervalues relative to what? Like, what's the alternative scenario here? Like, are you suggesting that you just keep Dorian Finney-Smith on the roster and deal with the repeater tax? Because I don't know, Paulo, like the scenario you laid out, it's pretty concerning what that could do years from now to decisions about far more important pieces of your roster, or your ability to use the MLE or non-taxpayer MLE, whatever it is, when you're actually ready to try and contend for a championship. There are some pretty serious repercussions. Like, what is the alternative scenario? I sure as hell hope no one's asking them and saying they should use a first-round pick instead. I've been told they really learned from that Ryan Anderson deal late in the Gerald Morey era about not using first-round picks to offload bad contracts. So they didn't want to do that here, and I hope no one's suggesting that they should. I don't know. I mean, there has to be some sort of sweetener to take on the DFS contract, and so if it's not a pick asset, I guess the only other option would be a player, but I'm not sure what player people are suggesting would go to the Hornets or a team taking in DFS. So I don't really agree with the idea that the Rockets undervalue second round picks. No, it's just that's the cost of doing business. Like, if Rafael Stone could have done this deal, including 1 or 2 second round picks instead of 3, I think he would have loved to do that. I highly doubt that he called up Charlotte and this was the offer and there was no negotiating. No, it's just in an NBA where more and more teams are close to the tax and there's less homes that you can offload bad salary to if you're trying to outright ditch it and not swap it for other bad money. You need to actually ditch it if you're trying to, help your tax situation. Like, if you're going to say Rafael Stone and the Rockets undervalue second round picks, tell me which of the alternative scenarios are clearly better, either keeping that bad deal on the books or incentivizing the team to take on the bad deal in other ways. I don't think it was due to a lack of negotiating. So I think it's not a pleasant deal. I'm not sitting here saying, oh, like A plus home run for Rafael Stone. No, 3 second-round picks to offload a failed signing that you made just 1 year ago. Yeah, it sucks. And sure, I'd love to have those second-round picks for other things, but to me, the deal is fine. It's not great, but it's fine. It's just the cost of doing business. And when you understand the context, I think it's perfectly understandable that they went down this road to get themselves out of a bad situation. It doesn't mean that the bad situation isn't of their own doing. It was and is, but I think there's nothing wrong with the deal itself. I guess that's how I'd frame it.
I think the argument, I think on the DFS thing, I think what some people were arguing was that, like, maybe you hold on to him into the season, and I'm going to counter this, but maybe you hold on to him into the season, you hope he regains some value, and you dump him later. Now, the issue with this is, and I am surprised people didn't immediately jump at this, is that it's a lot easier to salary dump during the off season when there's a lot of teams that can take the salary dump than to wait into the season and have 1 or 2 teams that just absolutely own you. Like there's nowhere else you can dump. So we set the price and you either pay it or you don't, and you're stuck paying tax when you really didn't need to. Now, 3 second-round picks seems like a steep price for a around $12 million expiring deal. Now, knowing that the Hornets are likely going to just dump it, I think that likely going to just buy him out. I think that tells you that even the Hornets have zero hope that Dorian Finney-Smith's going to make a comeback and be a useful player. Because there's upside on that deal. Like, if you're the Hornets and you're not contending now, having the dev cap is useless. You might as well give him a shot and see, hey, this guy has basically 2 more team options for the next 2 years. If he's something, like if he becomes a decent player again, that's an asset. Nobody has any faith in that. Like, they're buying him out immediately, and there's some upside to keeping him. So that they're not just doing it to do it. Then, like, as you go into the season, like the Rockets traded, then there's other things, right? Other than trade, like Dorian Finney-Smith, thankfully fits into a non-taxpayer MLE, which the non-taxpayer MLE that can be used for signings in the new CBA can also be used as a trade exception, which is what the Rockets did to make this deal. If the Rockets want to make this deal deeper into the season, you have to look into a team that has the non-taxpayer MLE, but didn't use it, or a team that held cap space well into the season. There's very few scenarios in which this happens. Like, the Thunder did this a while back in the year that they were like below the salary like floor. Last year, I think the Nets had some space. This year, the only thing that could do it is the Nets, but I don't think that's gonna come to be by the end of the offseason. They're likely going to use that space for something else, perhaps take a salary dump from somebody else. And so by the time you get into the season, you're gonna have no trade partners. And then there's the other thing. The Rockets dumped him into the MLE of the Hornets, which means this was not a scenario in which the Hornets had like a bunch of cap space and they didn't have anywhere to use it. It's not a scenario in which the Hornets had a TPE, a traded player exception, that was about to expire, that expired in 6 months, and it was likely not going to get used for anything, and so they just used it. No, in order for the Hornets to take this deal on, they foreclosed the possibility of signing someone up to $14 million a year, which is valuable. Like, there's still good free agents out there that they could have gotten signed. The Rockets had to entice them enough that they don't go after any of those guys, and instead take on this deal. Like, for example, like, are you trying to tell me that the Hornets who traded away Bridges couldn't have used, for example, Rui Hachimura on the deal that they got from the Clippers, or even a longer deal? They probably could have, but like, when you look at it from the Hornets' perspective, this could very well be viewed as, okay, this is Dorian Finney-Smith and 3 second-round picks versus, I don't know, Rui Hachimura and 0 second-round picks, right? Those are the scenarios you're competing with, and so that's the price you've got to pay. As far as the argument about Rafael Stone and the front office undervaluing second-round picks, This is not the case right here this offseason because I do think they got fair value on the trade up for Bruce. Just gonna leave it at that. And I think this is, considering the circumstances, I think this is very fair value for the DFS deal. But I think in the past, I think there's situations in which that you can point to that show this kind of. For example, and the most glaring example of this was when the Rockets held true to their word when Brook Lopez didn't, and they paid the Hawks, I think at the time, to take on a couple of rookie. I'm not sure if I'm conflating this, but to take on a couple of rookie contracts of guys that you probably should have been able to dump for nothing. At that moment, the Rockets were just so concerned about making sure that they got Brook Lopez that they just probably, negotiated a subpar salary dump with the Hawks. Because at that moment, you want that deal to be secret. Like, you don't want to be calling all around the league that you're dumping these contracts at that point, because if you are, teams are going to figure out that you're dumping them for a reason that may change your leverage in negotiations with free agents. But at that point in time, after Brook Lopez snubbed the Rockets and went back on his word, Stone chose to stay true to his and pay a ridiculous premium, in my opinion, to dump those contracts back then. And I think it cost us 3 or 4 second-round picks to dump the both of them. I think it was Josh Christopher and Ty Washington and Garuba. I can't remember which ones it was.
Yeah. But the bottom line there is that, you could argue that they undervalued the consequences, or they undervalued the second round picks relative to the consequences of going back on their word. I can understand that. What I don't like that I've seen the last few days is just the notion that, they include 3 second round picks and that means that they're, treating them like candy or what have you. No, you can only argue that they're undervalued if you're arguing in support of an alternative solution. And in this case, the consequences you laid out of keeping DFS and what it means for the tax burden, I just don't think would have been worthwhile. And by the way, one other point before we transition to our closing segment, the Rockets are now in position with that trade exception that they got for DFS to potentially have a lot of leverage and get a good player and or assets at the deadline from some other team that's trying to duck the tax if the circumstances warrant. Again, plan A, hopefully the Rockets don't need that and they're fine as is. But I think what they concluded, and I think they're right, is in this environment where so many teams are close to the tax line, there was much more liquidity with a traded player exception than there was the bad money of Dorian Finney-Smith. Even if he's expiring, that wouldn't offer any luxury tax savings. Even as an expiring, even prorated, the tax is the tax. It's relative to that player's salary for the year, how much he has left, and other players are prorated as well. So it wouldn't have been easy for them to dump, and it also wouldn't have had a ton of value around the league, even if it could be aggregated in tandem with other players. The traded player exception, the Rockets, if they need it, are now in the position where they can take back money from some other team and potentially extract a good deal down the road as well. So I just want to make that clear, that same argument that hurt the Rockets here in terms of leverage can potentially benefit them with the TPE at the deadline or even next offseason that lasts for a full calendar year if they need to use it.
Yeah, and before we move on, just for sake of comparison, because this happened as we are recording, the Pistons just dumped Caris LeVert in a deal that had them take back a couple of players, right? But the net salary relief was about $7 million. And for about $7 million of cap relief, the Pistons gave up 2 second-round picks. And Caris LeVert, who, as much of a meme as he is better than Dorian Finney-Smith was last season. So value seems about right. They dumped about 2/3 of what the Rockets dumped, and they paid about 2/3 of what the Rockets did for the dump. So yeah, just I think if the market was set, and I think in comparison it feels like fair compensation.
All right, let's wind down by looking at the rest of the roster. We'll go quickly through guys we talked about last week. Marcus Smart in particular, because it was rumored before free agency. We talked about the basketball merits, and if you want more insight on that, just check out our archives. But I think by and large, he's being looked at as a defensive wing in the mold of Dylan Brooks. He's obviously a little bit shorter, can't shoot as well, but he's better at ball handling, provides some insurance for Fred and Reed in the backcourt. And also because he's so insanely strong, that's where he can overcome the lack of height and still guard a lot of bigger players and have a lot of versatility, at least 1 through 4, and at times 1 through 5. Just ask Alperen Şengün in the playoffs. So Marcus Smart is someone that they're expecting to be a key rotation piece from day one. And so that gives you 9 guys with KD, Amen, Şengün, Fred, Jabari, Marcus, Reed, Tari, and Steven Adams. And yes, all of those guys are expected to be healthy and they report to camp. Maybe there'll be some minutes limitations, but no one is expected to be unavailable. That's 9 guys that they really, really like and believe in a lot as players this season. Not saying that there's no chances that some can be moved in trades later on this offseason. It's certainly possible, even though the primary window has passed between the draft and the first week of free agency. So there's not the inflection points, the deadline pressures. So I think you need to sort of prepare yourself for at least the strong possibility that those 9 are all going to be on the roster by the time the Rockets report to camp in late September. But then beyond that, we talked earlier about the importance of Clint Capella as insurance for Steven Adams, just needing a third center in general to get through 82 games. That's a 10th guy. Bruce Thornton is someone we hope looks really good at Summer League, a 4-year player in college that should be ready, and you want to give every opportunity to make an impact if he's able to provide that shooting that you were lacking. And then there's Bogdan, who the Rockets, as I reported, wanted to sign in buyout season last year, but it was too risky for Bogey at that time to pass on a $16 million team option that if the Clippers had been making a major trade to aggregate salary might have gotten picked up. So he didn't go the buyout route, but the Rockets have targeted him for a while. And at 33 years old, there's no reason to think he's necessarily washed. There's no injury history that I know of, at least not in terms of major injuries. So that's the 12th guy. And so I think moving forward, look, I'm sure the Rockets will, they'll cast a wide net. They've got 2 more minimum salary contracts they can hand out. They've got 2 ways. But I think going forward, we need to be reasonable in that not only is there a financial limitation, they lost Josh Okogie, who played his way into a 2-year, $12 million deal with the Utah Jazz, and that's more than, the Rockets only have minimums if they're going to try and avoid the tax for the reasons we laid out. Also, to give a salary that big, they would have had to eat into the non-taxpayer mid-level, which would have hard capped them at the first apron. So the Rockets financially couldn't make it work in the case of Josh Okogie, given the parameters we laid out and the flexibility they want to have to upgrade the team later in season if they need it, or if there's some sort of big deal later on where they need to take on bigger salary. But also, once you are talking about guys that are maybe 12th, 13th, 14th, something like that in the hierarchy entering training camp, you're not going to get your pick of the litter. Like, I know a lot of folks, like today, I've seen a lot of calls for Gary Trent Jr. and any conceivable minimum who could provide more value than a standard minimum. The secret about those guys, they're going to go to a situation in which they are further up in the hierarchy than 12th, 13th, 14th, whatever it is, entering training camp, because they want to have a clear enough role that they can play their way into not getting a minimum contract in the future. So that's not to say Rafael Stone shouldn't try. They absolutely should. But at the end of the day, it takes 2 to tango. A lot of, more established minimum guys probably won't want this situation. And you also want to make sure that you're not going to have a potential malcontent, i.e. a Cam Whitmore situation from this time a year ago, if you are going to keep someone, but you're just not going to play him. It has to be the right fit. So in terms of, everybody wants to add more shooting after what we saw last season. I mean, Bogdan's their guy. They went out and targeted him on night 1 of free agency for a reason. They wanted him as a buyout candidate for a reason. We'll see if he works out. I'm not saying for sure he is, but this was their guy. And so in terms of expectations moving forward, like, I won't rule out any, higher profile acquisitions, but it also wouldn't stun me if, maybe they give a hinky special to Isaiah Crawford as well, two-way from last year, who showed a lot of promise, or perhaps they keep him on a two-way this year because he is still eligible for at least one more year of that. Maybe Jayshawn Tate takes on the Jeff Green role. I know everyone's mad at Tate because of the foul in the playoffs, but the point is the reason the Rockets gave that vibes roster spot, let's call it, to Jeff Green as a vocal leader, you're just not realistically going to get like 15 players and all three two-way slots on guys who are ready to play super major minutes potentially this season. In a perfect world, yes, but in terms of, cohesion in the locker room, understanding roles, and also simply what players on the market are willing to accept, it doesn't work that way. So in terms of going forward, I think it's probably a lower tier than a lot of fans would like, not because the Rockets aren't trying, but it has to make sense. And I just want people to understand that in terms of, you can make a case that with the injury risk, maybe here being 11th or 12th in the hierarchy is a little higher than it is in a place where no one's coming off, leg surgery in the case of Steven and Fred. Okay, but that's what Bruce Thornton and Bogdanovic are for. Those were the guys that were aggressively targeted for those roles. So they are the first man up. And anyone conceivably that the Rockets sign from this point forward, they would be lower in the hierarchy. And thus, for the reasons I just laid out, it's probably not going to be a super splashy move. So I guess that's my review. Again, not telling you for sure it's going to work out. I mean, Bruce Thornton is a rookie. Bogdan did not play a whole lot the last year with the Clippers, so is there risk? For sure, but these are the guys they targeted, and I think they're going to give them the first opportunity at, minutes outside of those top 9. So I guess that's my review of, I guess, the sightings, what we've seen, and what we might see the remainder of the offseason. Paulo, any thoughts on how they put, the roster together after that top 9?
Yeah, so the way I'm looking at it, right, I'm looking at Fred Smart and Thornton as Fred Smart, Thornton, and Reed as the guards. Let's call them the guards. But if you want to look at it, point guard, shooting guard, I think Fred Smart and Thornton are the point guards. I think Amen and Reed Shepard are probably, the prototypical shooting guard, and Bogdanovic probably plays a little bit of 2, a little bit of 3. Because at this point in his career, he is a little bit slower, but he does have the length and, the girth, let's call it that, to defend up a position. And so, you probably have 3 point guards already. You probably have your 2 shooting guards, even though man is really positionless. Then you probably have your 3 threes as well. Your small forwards are likely going to be KD, Bogdanovic. And I do really think that Crawford gets a hinky special type of deal. And I think it's worth I think he is a guy who has potential. He has the measurables. He shot 12 from 3. I think he was pretty impressive as a high energy guy. So I think he gets one of the 3 spots that are available. Then you have Tari and Barry as the 2 power forwards. I think maybe a third guy there is probably what they'll target. And then you have Şengün, Steven Adams, and Capella as the 3 centers. I don't think they're bringing in any other centers. I don't think it would make much sense. So you have 2 spots. You have third string point guard / shooting guard, depending on what you believe Thornton is. And then you have third string power forward. And so looking at guys for those 2 positions, I think for power forward, it's really limited out there, right? You might be able to get a guy like Larry Nance, who's 34 at this point, who could play, maybe do a job there. You could maybe go after Maxi Kleber as a shooter there. You're always talking about guys who you're not certain are worth a roster spot. But then beyond that, Trendon Watford can be interesting, but he's 26. He's going to be looking for playing time. Jalen Wilson's interesting, but he's going to be looking for playing time. Probably, he was decent with the Nets. I'm not checking his stats out right now, but I remember watching him play. You have Rockets legend Kelly Olynyk, but I do think he's more of a 5 than a 4. And so that's it for power forwards. I think beyond that, maybe, if you really hit the jackpot, you can go after a guy like Nick Batum, who I'm not sure if he's retiring or not. But I think, that's about it. For the shooting guard, position, I do think there's some interesting names out there that the Rockets might be able to try to make a run at. I think Jordan Clarkson's pretty good for a third stringer, even though he's old and has never been that great of a player. A sleeper that I feel like people always sleeps under the radar that has really good length and is a really good shooter is Amir Coffey, who was with the Suns last season, but was with the Clippers for a really long time. I think he's someone that's worth a shot. And then, Gary Trent Jr. is never going to get. Bradley Beal is going to go ring casing. Matisse Thybulle has played 20 games each of the last 3 seasons. Maybe, he probably wants more playing time. So I think you're probably looking at a guy like Amir Coffey in the best case scenario, which is not terrible. But once again, you're looking at third stringers. I think the best guy that hasn't been signed that will be signed to me is going to be Isaiah Crawford. But yeah, you're looking at those names for the third string 2 and the third string 4, and that's if none of the guys in summer league really pop off, like any of the other guys besides Bruce really pop off, and you never know who's gonna get bought out that you might be able to get. But for the most part, I think guys that have a shot at playing rotation minutes are the guys that are on the team. And I do, I am an Isaiah Crawford guy, so I do think Isaiah Crawford has a chance to supplant, maybe Bogey in the rotation, depending on how Bogey looks coming back.
Yeah.
Because he hasn't had best of the last couple of seasons. So that's what I'm looking at. I think, lost Josh Okogie, but to a team that's going to pay him $6 million this year with a team option for next year, you were never going to outbid that. If Jeff Green wants to come and be the third string 4, I think that's a possibility. I'm not sure if he's retired already. And then from the other guys that you had from last season, Tate could be that third string 4. He's probably better than all the guys that I listed.
From what I've heard, Tate is much more likely than Jeff. I think Jeff's probably aged out, and I think everybody knows it.
Yeah, and then
Tate is beloved as a teammate. I know he's a lightning rod on social media, but he's a very good teammate. He's loved in the clubhouse, so he does provide still a lot of those same values.
Yeah, and although Aaron Holiday was productive as a shooter, I think with Isaiah Crawford you have too many tiny guards to not with Isaiah Crawford, with Bruce Thornton.
Right.
You probably have too many small guards to bring him back. So yeah, I think they go more length on that spot.
Yeah. The one distinction I would make, I do think there's a need to target a two-way center that you can develop. I'm really going to be watching Oscar Clough, the big man out of Purdue. If he has a strong summer league and you can maybe look at him as a two-way candidate, or maybe there's some other young big that you can bring along in that role, I think it can prepare you potentially for Clint Capella aging out or becoming too expensive for your model, or for using, as mentioned earlier, Clint Capella as salary filler at this year's deadline. If there is something bigger you want to do, because even though you lost DFS as filler, you did keep Clint Capella. So in a scenario where you eventually look at Clint Capella as matching salary in a trade, I do think you'd love to have a young big man that you can trust that can sop up some of those third string center minutes for very cheap. And so hopefully the Rockets can find that this offseason. I think Oscar Clough out of Purdue will get the first opportunity at Summer League, but regardless, that's small potatoes. We're talking two ways there. As far as the standard slots, I think you laid it out well. And the bottom line, I just ask people to remember, it's not that the Rockets didn't target these positions, that they're overlooking them. No, they simply prefer Bruce Thornton and Bogdan Bogdanovic. These are the guys they targeted for a reason. So in terms of, 10 and 11, or I guess it's 11 and 12, we should probably call Clint Capella 10, especially given the Steven Adams injury situation. Bruce and Bogey are the first two up. And beyond that, yeah, I think, in a perfect world, you want every roster spot taken up by a really good player that's able to give you good minutes on any given night. That's the ideal. In reality, it often doesn't work that way. And that's why my expectations are a little lower and less splashy. I would love to be wrong, but if I'm right, I don't think it's anything to be alarmed about. It's just how roster construction goes in the modern NBA. Anyway, we'll wind this pod down here and we'll pick up more basketball-centric analysis in the weeks ahead. Today, we've been talking largely business because these deals have been finalized in the first week of free agency in terms of, the core 9, those established 9 at the top of the rotation, and what this team's ceiling is relative to the rest of the Western Conference. We'll have plenty of dead time after Summer League to pick that up and take stock of the lay of the land and where the Rockets are in the West. We'll have that in shows ahead. Today, we're looking at the business of the first week of free agency, along with a little bit of previewing Summer League, and we'll be back in a few days, midway through Summer League, to talk about what we're seeing out in Las Vegas. For now, though, we're done, and if you want more content from me or Paulo or in between our shows, the best place to get it is on social media. My handle is at Ben DuBose. Paulo's is at Paulo Alves NBA. And this show, the Rockets Launch Pod, presented by Clutch Fans. If you go to LaunchPod790 on Twitter/X and go to Linktree in the bio, that's got all the links you need to support friends, partners, sponsors of the program, USA Today's Rockets Wire, Clutch Fans, Sports Talk 790, official radio flagship of the team, and also the distributors of this show, like Apple, YouTube, Spotify. If you've not already subscribed, please do. Leave a positive review, and that's how we can keep looking good to those aforementioned friends, partners, and sponsors and keep this program running as one of the most active podcasts covering Houston Rockets basketball. All right, for today, we're done. For Paulo, I'm Ben. As always, we appreciate you guys and girls so much for listening, and please come back soon for more analysis of your Summer League Houston Rockets.